Go right ahead.
Thanks, Beth. Good morning, everybody. My name is Gina Sampaio, and I'm the curator for the Lebanon Township Museum. And I'm honored to be here with my associate curator, Robbie-Lynn Mwangi, to present Invisible Sons, the Carlisle Indian School students in New Hampton. We'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we will be using the term Indian during our presentation, as it was a part of the official name of the Carlisle Indian School. And it's the term that is used in resources from the early 1900s that we will be quoting from. Additionally, we ask in advance for your grace in forgiving us any mispronunciations of Indigenous names that we'll be using. We're joining you today from inside the museum, which is located in the former New Hampton Schoolhouse. New Hampton is located along the Musconetcong River in the western corner of Lebanon Township, on the border between Hunterdon and Warren counties. New Hampton is one of 18 unincorporated communities in Lebanon Township, and this schoolhouse was district number 8 in the local school system, and the building was built in 1823 on land that is a part of the Lenape-Hoking, the traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape people and their ancestors who lived here for thousands of years before the arrival of Europeans. As a matter of fact, as a quick aside, we just would like to share that we're very proud that part of our museum's permanent collection includes artifacts from one of the most significant Paleo-Indian sites in the Northeast, called the Plenge site, which is just a few miles from here. A second floor addition was built, which is where we're seated now, in the 1870s. The building was used as both a public school and a Sunday school into the 1920s, with Miss Mary Sharps as the last known teacher here. It continued to be used as a Sunday school into the 1950s. It then sat empty and neglected for many years until a dedicated group of local historians raised funds to preserve the building. It reopened as a museum in 1982, and the first curator, Dorothea Connolly, tracked down former students for a reunion here. Some of them were kind enough to share their recollections of life and school here in New Hampton in the early 1900s. This past January, we were reading over some of those memories and came across this statement: Indian boys worked on the farms, farmers had to clothe and feed them. Now, this was rather intriguing, but it also raised a lot of questions. Luckily, we also found this note: Indian boys from the Carlisle school went to this school. Now, this was months before there was news coverage about unmarked graves at Indian residential schools or the remains of Indigenous children being exhumed from Carlisle to be returned to their families. And admittedly, we didn't know much about residential schools, and the name Carlisle didn't mean anything to us then. As a matter of fact, we didn't really expect to find anything in our initial Google search for Carlisle School. We were amazed by the amount of information we found on the Dickinson College Carlisle Indian School Digital Resource Center page. And so we'd like to just start off our presentation by sharing with you a short overview of the Carlisle School that was produced by the Dickinson College. It was through the Digital Resource Center page that we first began to fill this glaring gap in our education. We read up on the conversion of the former Army barracks in Cumberland County, Pennsylvania, and were horrified to discover that First Director Pratt's motto was, "Kill the Indian to save the man." We are astounded by the words and the images we found there, most notably the contrast photos that they shared. Pratt had commissioned local photographer John N. Choate to take before and after pictures to document the progress that they were making in civilizing the Indian children. The photographs were then sent to officials in Washington, to potential charitable donors, and to other reservations to recruit new students. We learned how Pratt's program soon evolved to include what he and teacher Ann Ely dubbed the outing program. As can be said of much of Pratt's mission, the outing program may have been initiated with the best of intentions, but ultimately was just another component of forced assimilation. It should be noted that the outing program was also referred to as an apprenticeship for civilization. Students would be immersed in the dominant European culture by living with non-native families, speaking English, dressing in Western style clothing, attending Christian church and Sunday school, and by working for the families, learning a hireable trade. However, while the outing program may have been successful in providing job training, white society did not readily accept or hire Native Americans, and no formal job placement program existed for graduates. The students were expected to refer to their patron families as their country parents and siblings. They were expected to abide by the rule agreement that they would sign, although the same can't always be said for Carlisle. The Digital Resource Center page has abundant examples of letters from students long since graduated, pleading for their past wages earned while on outing. For the patron families, the program could almost be equated to domestic missionary work combined with a student exchange program. They were not to just have the students work for them, they were to welcome them into their homes and treat them as sons and daughters. The first patron in New Hampton was William Riddle, who lived with his wife, Lita, and their two daughters, Blanche and Celeste. Their home was located just across the Musconetcong River from the schoolhouse and could be seen from here. Students that stayed with them would cross the river by foot via the Shoddy Mill Bridge. In an article in the Washington Star from February 1901, William was praised for being one of the most enterprising farmers of this locality, for having the floor of his cow stable laid with cement and a drain made in it, connected with a pipe that carries off all the waste. The article also mentions that this improvement is his own idea, one that we think might have been influenced by his other profession as the overseer of roads in Warren County, which he was also publicly praised for in a 1906 article in the same paper. These articles show us that clearly William was very innovative and a progressive thinker. And with no sons to help on the farm, the outing program was a logical fit for him and Lita. We did find one 1904 article that was sensationalized enough to hit the national wire, and it claimed that the Riddles were unhappy and the program was a failure, but the story is completely unsubstantiated. The Riddles didn't even have a student by that name at that time. Additionally, all the other evidence points to the contrary. The Riddles hosted 19 students over 16 consecutive years. Another local article, this time from the Hunterdon County Democrat, encouraged local farmers to participate in the outing program by saying that Carlisle students are not afraid of hard work and that the sun cannot hurt their complexions. It goes on to somehow manage to continue to sound racist, even in their attempt to shatter stereotypes, by adding that the students come fully dressed, do not use war paint, and will scalp only bald heads anymore. The Riddles even introduced the concept to their neighbors, the Marlats. Between the two families, 34 students came to live and work here in New Hampton over a 26-year period. Some of their stays were short-lived, and we know of 2 that ran away. Some returned to the Riddle or Marlat families multiple times. Some only spent the summer here working, while others stayed for a year or even more, in which case they would have attended school right here in our schoolhouse. Here at the museum, we have lists compiled by former curators with names of students that were enrolled here in the early 1900s. On them, we find many surnames that we are familiar with, names of families who have been established in this community for many generations, and some who continue to have a presence here today. Conspicuously absent from these records are the names of the Indigenous boys and young men that matriculated here while on outing. So we refer to them as New Hampton's invisible sons. And today, we'd like to bring them out of the shadows by telling you more about 6 of them: Alan Blackchief, Shield Thunderball, Charles Paisano, Mitchell White, Philip Claremont, and W. Howard Findley.
Before we tell you about them, we'd like to share an anecdote from an 11-year-old boy who did not go on outing here. He was in one of the first group of students to arrive at Carlisle in 1879. In his memoir, O2 Kute, whom you may know as actor and author Luther Standing There, recounted that when he arrived at the school, an instructor called up each student before a blackboard chalked with Anglo first names and told him or her to point out a first name. When my turn came, I took the pointer and acted as if I were about to touch an enemy. The pointer fell on the name Luther, and thereafter he became Luther Standing There of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. We don't mean to confuse you by including him today, but his experience in getting a new name illustrates a typical occurrence for Carlisle students. For example, a 13-year-old boy from the Tanowode Seneca Nation in Western New York was sent to the Carlisle School. His paperwork identifies him as Alan Blackchief, but we also see what they call his Indian name listed as Gandio Ho. He is pictured here with his brother Hiram. He arrived at Carlisle in November 1891, and 5 months later was the first Carlisle student sent to New Hampton on outing. He lived with and worked for the Riddles for the next 17 months. While we've not been able to find proof that Alan went to school here, we do know that students who stayed on outing for the calendar year were expected to attend the local school during their stay. The New Hampton School would be the local school for any children that lived in the Shoddy Mill Road house, Additionally, the notes that started this research clearly said that Indian boys attended school here. The Digital Resource Center page continually uploads more primary documents, and we are hoping one day that will include documents to show that Alan definitely went to school here. In a letter sent back to the school in 1911, Alan praises the outing program and says that he'd like to send his daughter to the school someday.
I have 3 children now, 2 girls and a boy. The older girl is 8 years old. I often tell her about Carlisle and ask her if she would like to go. Since I returned from Carlisle, I have been trying to do the best I know how and to show others that I have been to the school. I praise Carlisle and what it has taught me, especially the outing system. And now I'm working for myself on the farm.
Well, Derek valued correspondence with graduates. An article in a 1912 issue of a school publication called The Arrow says that through these letters, they could gather definitive records which demonstrate the value of Indian education and conclusively show that the only good Indian is not a dead Indian. The next student we'd like to tell you about is Shield Thunderball. In the photo you see, Shield is on the right, Henry Red Kettle is on the left, and William Crazy Bull is in the center. All 3 boys were Oglala Lakota students from the Pine Ridge Agency. In this photo, both Shield and Henry are approximately 12 years old. They arrived in Carlisle on February 19, 1891. a date we find significant due to its proximity to the Wounded Knee Massacre that occurred at the Pine Ridge Agency in South Dakota on December 29, 1890. Though what started the massacre is debated, it is known that the US Army began indiscriminately shooting at a band of Lakota people, and by the time it was over, more than 250 men, women, and children had been killed, and 51 were wounded. Though the massacre at Wounded Knee was not the last armed conflict between Native Americans and the US Army, it marked the definitive end of the Indian Wars. After Wounded Knee, the remaining Indian tribes were either subdued or forcibly assimilated into mainstream white US society. Shield and Henry arrived with 16 other students from Pine Ridge just 6 weeks after the massacre. It should be noted that many other Lakota children from the agency were already enrolled before Wounded Knee. Shield would remain enrolled in Carlisle for a little over 5 years. He spent 3.5 of them working on farms in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Shield spent the summer of 1894 working on Riddle's farm. The next year, his father wrote a letter asking if Shield could please be sent home. Pratt's response stated,
I have to respectfully report that Shield is in the beginning of his school life instead of the end of it. His term of 5 years is not yet up, and I see no reason why he should return. I suspect that if you ask the parents of children at the agency boarding schools, 9 out of 10 would say that they wanted their children home. It is not in many of the Indian parents to do as the whites do and compel their children and make the necessary sacrifices for that. So that it's a duty resting upon us to hold both the parents and their children to the school life and encourage them to make the necessary sacrifices.
Eventually returned to South Dakota, became a farmer, and was employed as a forest ranger. He married Josie Bissonette, a fellow Oglala Lakota girl and Carlisle student. Their descendants still live in South Dakota today.
Charles Paisano was a member of the Laguna Pueblo, which is located approximately 45 miles west of Albuquerque. Our current Secretary of the Interior, Deborah Ann Holland, is a Laguna tribal member. Charles spent 6 years of his life as a Carlisle student, and of those, he spent nearly 3 years in New Hampton, from 1899 to 1902. He's the only student who worked for both the Riddles and the Marlatts during his time in New Hampton. Unfortunately, during his last outing with the Riddles, Charles became ill with cholera morbus, and he died at the age of 18. Cholera morbus was a non-technical term that was a bit of a catch-all for various intestinal problems. One account of his death said that he died from eating too much green fruit and drinking ice water, while another report claims that it was appendicitis. Either way, unfortunately, it appears that Charles was in great pain before his death. Carlisle school physician Dr. Diven was sent to Hampton Junction, the same train station that all of the students sent on outing in New Hampton used to arrive and depart. Dr. Diven escorted Charles' body back so that he could be buried in New Mexico. His obituary in the Belvedere Apollo describes him as very bright and industrious, and shared that he had plans to marry his sweetheart and they wanted to settle down here in New Jersey. That sort of personal information shared in his obituary, along with a death notice from the Washington Star saying that Charles would be missed by his Sunday school friends, show us that the Riddles and the entire community had accepted Charles and had gotten to know him. Though we do feel compelled to point out that the obituary ends with the note that Charles and his fiance's parents were not civilized. Considering the amount of time that Charles spent with the Riddles, combined with the fact that Sunday school was also held in this building, makes it highly likely that Charles spent time in this very room. Our introduction to the next student was initially made through Skip Riddle, who is a Riddle family historian. He shared with us a 1907 newspaper clipping that read, "Mitchell White, who has been working on the Riddle's farm, has returned to the Carlisle School to resume his studies." Mitchell was a favorite with the boys here. He is an expert harmonica player. 8-year-old Mitchell Alunhiawakuan White and his older brother John of the Mohawk tribe in upstate New York enrolled in Carlisle together on the same day. Mitchell spent 3 years at the school, followed by another 3 years on outing. His longest outing was 2 consecutive years with the Riddles from September 1904 until September 1906. By that time, Blanche Riddle was married and living elsewhere. The 1905 census counts 4 residents at the house on Shoddy Mill Road: William, Lita, Celeste, and Mitchell. Mitchell was listed as a laborer by trade, and daughter Celeste as a violinist. Knowing that Mitchell was a musician himself, we can't help but wonder if he and Celeste bonded over music. Not only have we had the great fortune of speaking with a Riddle descendant, we've also been lucky enough to make contact with one of Mitchell's descendants, his granddaughter, Dr. Llewellyn White, who was kind enough to share these photos with us. She also confirmed that her grandfather enjoyed playing harmonica for his entire life and that he named his own daughter Celeste. Dr. White is an author and professor who has earned her PhD in American Indian Studies with a focus on Indigenous education and language revitalization. In the Journal of American Indian Education, Dr. White wrote,
"As a child, my dad told stories about Grandpa and Carlisle Indian School. He talked of Carlisle like it was a prestigious institution where Father got an education. He told stories of the wild Indians from out west, about Grandpa meeting Jim Thorpe and how impressed he was when he shook his big hands. What I remember most is when my dad ended with, he didn't like to talk about it."
Dr. White also serves as the founder and the spokesperson for the Carlisle Indian School Farmhouse Coalition, which seeks to preserve a farmhouse at the Carlisle School, which provided an agricultural classroom and quarters for student farm laborers. The coalition seeks to repurpose the farmhouse as a heritage center dedicated to Carlisle Indian School, its students, descendants, and the broader legacy of Indian boarding schools. It would be a place for visitors to go after touring the school grounds and visiting the cemetery to help facilitate grieving, for reflecting, and for celebrating Indigenous people's resiliency.
At the age of 20, Philip Claremont from the Rosebud Agency in South Dakota arrived at the Hampton Junction Railroad Station to live with and work for the Marlett family for a full year. Although we have just begun our research on the Marletts, we do know that they were outing patrons for about 12 years, starting with Father John before son Alfred took over the farm and took in 15 students over that time. You'll notice that this form lists the Marletts' residence as being in Washington in Warren County, but in other places we see it listed as New Hampton. We now know where his farm it was, and it would be considered Warren County by today's standards. Most significant to us is that this outing evaluation confirms in writing that Philip attended the New Hampton School and had Miss Mary Sharps as a teacher. She was likely the teacher for most of the Carlisle students that may have gone here, as she was employed here from 1905 to 1928. She was remembered fondly by many of her former students who came to the reunion in 1982. Philip enrolled in Carlisle 4 separate times: in 1908 at age 17, in 1911 at age 20, in 1914 at age 23, and in 1916 at age 25. His Carlisle experience consisted mainly of work outings. He seemed to be using it less as school and more as an employment service. While he was at Carlisle, he worked as a writer, mechanic, and compositor in the printing office. A compositor is the person who arranges type for printing. 3 of his outings were to work on farms, and his last outing was at the Ford Motor Company. His time with Ford ended in 1918 when he enlisted in the Army for World War I. We're not sure how Philip's time was spent in the Army, but it is noted in the student publication that some of the outing students who enlisted went into the Army Corps of Engineers as a result of their training at Ford. Philip wrote a letter to Carlisle from his basic training at Fort Dodge, Iowa, with the 163rd Depot Brigade, 11th Battalion, to inquire about the pay he was owed from his work at Ford. He closes with this note about camp life.
I have been in camp for nearly a month, and so far I enjoy it. There are many Carlisle students here, and so it makes the boys feel like if they were in school. Mr. Holy Eagle is the bugler and is sure fine. I am now acting like a corps and proud of it. Hoping to hear about the lost money. Respectfully yours, Philip Claremont.
Mr. Holy Eagle was a friend from the print office, Philip from the Rosebud Reservation. He was also a bugler at camp and may have been the Carlisle School bandmaster, James Holy Eagle. Philip later lived and raised a family in South Dakota and is buried there. The last student we'll tell you about today was also the last Carlisle student that was sent to New Hampton, William Howard Finley, called Howard by his family and friends. 15-year-old Howard traveled with his older sister Alice from Colville Reservation in Washington State to the Carlisle School in November of 1917. 5 months later, they were each sent on their first outings. Alice to work as a domestic for a family in Philadelphia, and Howard to work on the Marlett farm. Just 6 weeks after his arrival, Howard ran away. The Carlisle School had a protocol for this situation that included settling accounts with patrons and searching for runaways. A letter from the school's chief clerk in charge to the Marletts says he would like the clothing that Howard left behind to be returned to the school. Alfred Marlett writes back to let him know that Howard took all of his belongings with him. Months later, the Carlisle School shut down abruptly, leaving staff scrambling to account for students that were on outing. The Digital Resource Center has letters from Native parents a full year after the school shut down, inquiring about the whereabouts of their children. We have not found any record showing an effort on the school's behalf to find Howard, but we have confirmed that he eventually made it back to his family and lived in Washington State for the rest of his life. However, it seems there was a good deal of time that the Finleys did not know of Howard's whereabouts. Thus, after Howard's disappearance, Alice became sick with pneumonia and died 3 days later. A letter from their parents expresses their extreme sorrow and disappointment that Howard did not accompany his sister's body home. They share that this grief was only further compounded by the fact that a third child of theirs had drowned just 2 months before.
The Finleys were not alone in their grief. We know that hundreds of students perished while at the school or on outing. Some were buried in Carlisle, some in their patrons' towns, some made it home, and others still have unknown final resting places. But even still, it's difficult to paint the entire Carlisle experience with a negative brush. Dr. White has extensively surveyed descendants of Carlisle students and found that their ancestors' experiences run the gamut, from runaways, abuse, and death, to students that spoke highly of their time there and sent their own children to the school. We chose these 6 students to share with you, partially because they help to illustrate the fact that the ages and experiences of students varied greatly over the years. But these are the stories of just 6 individuals who were part of 34 that lived, learned, and worked here in New Hampton, and belong to the much larger group of nearly 8,000 who attended the Carlisle School, which means there are at least that many stories waiting to be told. So even though there were no residential schools in New Jersey, there were nearly 900 patron families who hosted over 3,000 outings throughout the state. How many of their stories are a part of your county's history and are waiting to be told? We'd like to encourage all of you that are involved in studying local history to consider researching your town's invisible sons and daughters. The Carlisle Indian School Digital Resource Center page is an incredible resource that is continually uploading new images and documents. From the time we first started our research until now, we discovered new information about the 6 students that we're focused on. We highly recommend this site, which can be found at carlisle.indian.dickinson.edu. We'd also like to share that the Carlisle Indian School Farmhouse Coalition, spearheaded by Carlisle School student descendant Dr. Llewellyn White, has a GoFundMe page to raise funds to transform the farmhouse into a heritage center. You can read more about the project and donate if you are able at gofundme.com/Carlisle-Indian-School-Farmhouse. Lastly, we would be remiss to not publicly acknowledge the groups and individuals who have provided invaluable assistance to us in this research, including the Carlisle Indian School Digital Resource Center, Barbara Landis, Kate Timer, Gilbert Skip Riddle, Catherine Koch, the Warren County Library, Mayor Mike Schmidt, Dr. Llewellyn White, Elizabeth Cole, Sharon Hardy, Mary Newton, and not listed, the New Jersey Historical Commission for giving us the platform to share the stories of New Hampton's invisible sons. It's been an absolute honor. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we are going to answer Q&A. And let's see here. So I'll read the questions, you answer them?
Sure, you're gonna
like
answer the questions.
We can take them.
Yeah.
All right, how did the students come to the school? Were they sent willingly by parents or against their will?
From I would say the individuals that we studied, I think they went willingly, but sometimes we wonder if they feel like they were between a rock and a hard place and the decision was almost made for them. Other students, like we said, sent their children back to the school. So that would be an answer that would be different for every student that we've studied and probably every student. The next question I'm going to jump right into says, were students allowed to return to their homes at all? And it seemed like mostly no. They signed a contract when they started that it was a 5-year program. We've seen letters from students, not necessarily students that were sent here, but once you get on the resource center page, you can just go and go down rabbit holes because it's so fascinating.
We did a lot.
We did a lot. But there were letters from students, and I mean, you have to understand, they're not even children, they're adults in their 20s begging, can I go home? My father is ill, he's dying. I would like to leave outing and go help my family for a week or a month, and being told that, no, you cannot go home.
How many families like the Whites connected to the school are working to amplify the stories there?
I'm not sure, to tell you the truth. When Dr. White did her surveys, she spoke to many descendants. I don't know how many of them are involved in the Farmhouse Coalition project. Dr. Llewellyn White is the only one that we've been fortunate enough to be in touch with. So I can't answer that question fully. I'm sorry.
I'd like to take the next one.
Okay, please do.
Based on your research, it seems likely that other historic sites around New Jersey also receive students on outing from Carlisle. Do you know of other sites in New Jersey that have done this kind of research and interpretation? Well, I have to say we don't know of other sites right now. I hope there are other sites, and perhaps sharing this will mean that we'll hear about other sites that are already doing it. But more than that, when we realized 3,000 outings had occurred in New Jersey, we realized it was a New Jersey story. And we are very hopeful that eventually all of the students who came here would be remembered in New Jersey in some way. So we almost want to issue a challenge to other organizations in New Jersey to do the research and bring the students that were in their community out of the.
Although I do have to say, we have had contact with a few other small sites. There was somebody, I think, in Plainfield
Starting to work.
that we're starting to work on. We haven't heard any follow-up on them, but we have piqued the interest of a few other places, but this is a much broader platform for us. So we're hoping to reach out to a lot more people this way. And that kind of goes along with Sarah's next question about organizations of former Carlisle students and or their descendants. Have you considered connecting with their descendants? We think that's part of the next step for us. We really have a sort of a vision or a pipe dream of connecting with a larger organization and being, I don't know if it's a database or what it is, but a place for smaller historical sites like us who can kind of get the on the ground information. We know which old newspapers to look for. We have the school records, things that people wouldn't be able to find from far away, that smaller historical sites can do that research and share it for descendants that want to find out about their ancestors' time on outing. That is something we would really like to pursue very much.
We do think that we're in a really unique position here because the schoolhouse where these 30, well, not all 34 went to school, but the schoolhouse where so many of them actually went to school is preserved and open to the public, that this is a chance for descendants to connect with their ancestors that they might have been here. We have that feeling frequently of they were here in this room where we're standing.
And I would just want to add that it's been such a wonderful pleasure for us to be in touch with Dr. White. She was so thrilled to hear the things about, for example, that the Riddle's daughter was named Celeste and that she was a musician, because we all three of us wondered, is that why her grandfather named his daughter Celeste? And then it occurred to me, maybe Dr. White wants to hear more about this area. So I just wrote a few descriptive paragraphs of what the schoolhouse is like, what the river is like, that there was a water wheel at the time at the mill, and some of the other memories from students about taking sleigh rides together and having little concerts and musicales. And she loved getting that information so much that it only fueled my desire to want to be able to share with other outing descendants little stories to help them connect with what their ancestors' experiences were like. So that is something we would like to do more of.
I think we both have
anything that has surprised me. What has surprised you, Robbie-Lynn?
Well, for me, it was the constant conflict of trying to define what this was. Yeah. So we talked about it all the time with our research assistant too, about, was this an all bad thing? Was this a good thing? Where do you land in it? Because it seemed like certainly the intention was to erase a culture, and it was certainly cultural genocide, and you can't pretend it wasn't. But over and over again, students took a hold of the opportunity and felt like they were being given something good, and really continued to praise it for a long time. And I think that's an experience immigrants have a lot too, where they have to assimilate into the new culture, or they're forced, they are grateful for the opportunities. What we started to conclude was it's a lot like a refugee experience that the Carlisle students had. So that was surprising for me, was how it seemed like good and bad at the same time.
Right. I mean, it has come up over and over again. It's not cut and dry. We can't say, was this good or was this bad? Were the Riddles bad people? Were they good people? Or the Marlats, or anybody that was involved in the program? I mean, on one hand, I want to say, well, the Riddles and Marlats were very good and progressive. I mean, with so much of the overwhelming culture being, these are Indians, they're savages, they're not civilized, and to let them into your home where you have two daughters living, I imagine might have shocked some of their neighbors and might have been a very progressive act. But yeah, that probably overall is our biggest surprise, is how much we can constantly debate. Was this good or was this bad? There were individual good experiences in this that make it so hard to answer. How long did the students stay at this school? Their time at the Carlisle school was a 5-year contract. Some students completed 5 years and then were readmitted. They wanted to go back and did another 5 years. How long did they stay at this school? was dependent on some outings were just for the summer. And if they worked on a farm over the summer, they wouldn't have gone to school in the New Hampton schoolhouse. But as some of the boys, as we mentioned, stayed here for a full 12 or 17 or 24 months, then they were expected to enroll in school while they were here.
And also some of the definitions of how things worked at Carlisle evolved over time. So the way things functioned in the first 10 or so years of Carlisle really changed to near the end. So like the example of Philip Claremont enrolling and disenrolling himself as really a young adult is not something that I think we would see in the younger students based on in the students who might have been enrolled early on in Carlisle's history. Thank you, Sarah.
I'll read that one. Do you have any information on whether some students stayed in New Jersey and settled down there? I would say the only thing that we personally found was that Charles Paisano had wanted to settle down in New Jersey, but then unfortunately he died. I haven't seen anything else that's, there was one article I saw, it was from Lambertville, New Jersey, or Flemington, New Jersey, which aren't far from here. They're in Hunterdon County, about a young man that might have stayed. And I'm sorry, now I can't remember the details on that, but no, we don't see a lot of evidence of that, maybe something in passing.
That's a good question.
That is a good question.
How are you facilitating tribal citizens to steward their own heritage?
Ruth Ann, we are failing in that department so far. So we would love input and suggestions on that. And that is something that we need to add to our overall pipe dream for this project. I just want to also point out, this is all so new to us, and we don't have experience with research, and we're both relatively new to museum work. So we're very open to everything that helps us to be better researchers and I can't think of the word I'm trying to say, but better in this department. So thank you for that.
Oh, this is a good idea too. All right, this is wonderful work. Whatever you're making to have Indigenous people more involved, not just contacting former family members, but involving Indigenous people here in New Jersey who might widen the understanding of this work. Do Indigenous people serve on your board? Do you have a working committee for this project? So we love that. That all sounds wonderful. One of the things we ask ourselves all the time, and even in tackling this research, is what part of this is our story? And the part of it that's our story is the students who were on outing right here in New Hampton, which is why we're focused on those. So I do think that including Indigenous people is something we would like to do as we move forward.
And once again, and we are 2 part-time township employees. We don't have a board and we don't really have a committee. This is a much broader project than anything that's ever been attempted by this museum or by us. So as it seems to be growing into something much bigger than we anticipated, those are things that we are actually going to have to figure out how to make happen.
So that answered all of our questions. And we believe that the links were all shared on the chat, and I know the links will be sent out later to all the participants. Gina?
That's it. So thank you very much. And we hope we've inspired you to start research in your own areas.
Good night.